So we're hold up. All right. Well, we saw that Mill tried to defend utilitarianism against the charge that it is a philosophical theory that gives us a low view of humanity, viewing us as no more than creatures of pain or pleasure, and the fact that Jeremy Bentham said all pleasures are on a par if their quantity is the same, made them susceptible to the criticism that, well, what then differs us, or what then is the difference between us and an animal, because, as I said last time, on Bentham's view, if you get as much pleasure as a pig from eating slop as somebody might get from reading poetry or going to the opera or thinking up a new scientific theory, it's all the same, And so Mill tried to say that no, we can introduce quality as well as quantity into this notion of pleasure, and there are pleasures that human beings can experience that the pig out there in the field knows nothing of. In fact, this was Mill's test for higher pleasures. He said, you don't ask the pig out there in the field. I may have said this last time, because he knows only one side of the issue, but you ask the person who's experienced both. And I said that we don't, and he says the person who has experienced both will automatically choose the higher pleasure. But does that really happen in the real world? We don't. We don't choose the sorts of things that Mill thinks are higher pleasures. And I gave you the example of people preferring going to wrestling rather than a classical guitar concert. Now, Mill gets criticized for being elitist on this, because what are the higher pleasures for him? Well, they're exactly the kinds of things that a sophisticated, well-educated British intellectual in the 19th century, who's a university professor, should think are the good things in life, right? The ability to appreciate poetry, novels, plays, symphony concerts, right? What he says are the higher pleasures are the products of the intellect and the imagination, and that is true of artistic works. And he says these are superior to the products of mere sensation. But we mentioned last time that this actually makes him abandon hedonism, because if he says it's better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool or a pig satisfied, then basically it shows he's saying it's better to have the higher pleasure, say, of discussing philosophy than just being a happy fool with the pleasures of sensation. And what this highlights is whatever makes these higher pleasures that Mill talks about valuable in themselves, it can't be just pleasure itself, right? Because Socrates is dissatisfied. He has a less amount of pleasure. So this hints or implies that there are other things that give these so-called higher pleasures value besides pleasure alone. Now, why does this contradict Mill's hedonism? Because a hedonist says there's only one thing that is valuable in itself as the goal of ethics, namely pleasure or happiness. And so So Mill claimed to be a hedonist, but his move of specifying pleasures that are higher in quality seems to abandon hedonism. As I say in the slide, what makes the higher pleasures higher cannot be pleasure alone. And so some other standard of value is being sneaked in, and this would undermine the hedonist claim that pleasure is the only ultimate standard of goodness. Now, the thing is, most modern utilitarians are like Jonathan Glover, who you saw in the video. And by the way, there is a link to that video. As I said, it's the only one that's legal out there on the internet. So I gave you a link to it if you haven't seen it. Most contemporary utilitarians recognize pleasure as one of many things that are valuable in and of themselves. So they're called pluralists. They recognize a plurality of standards of intrinsic goods. Some of the things that have been proposed by pluralists are knowledge as an unqualified good in itself, self-realization or the satisfaction of human preferences. We're not going to go into some of these, but the point is, most modern utilitarians just out front abandon hedonism. Now, a person who's a notable exception to this is Peter Singer. And if you haven't yet done all of your extra credits, you might look at the Peter Singer lecture there in that folder. Well, you don't have to do any of them. That's why it's extra credit. But you may do as many as 2 for 10 points extra credit each. Okay, so no one's required. But if you're on the borderline or something, you might want to do it. I mean, people have received A's because some extra credit have put them over the top, and I've had people miss A's. I mean, even if I go down a little bit below 90%, still, you got to make the cut somewhere, and no matter where you make the cut, somebody's going to just miss it. So I never worry about somebody just missing getting an A or a B, because it's always going to be the case, So I look at it and I say, hey, they had the option of doing some extra credits that could have put them over the top. They didn't. Too bad. You get a B for the course instead of an A. You could have gotten an A if you'd just done some of the extra credits. That happens. I mean, doing both of them makes about between a 3 to 4 point difference in your final average. That's huge. That's why I don't let people do more than that. I mean, if you're just missing it, that can make the difference between a C or a B or a B or an A, so. Okay, so to move on, well, I mentioned this that, there's a modern technique of a cost-benefit analysis that uses an identifiable countable unit. I really need to put the slide next to the one on Bentham and the Hedon. So in other words, even though we can't specify with any exactness what counts as a Hedon, we know what counts as $1. And another way of looking at, say, the question of whether to build the Bakun Dam, obviously the first way is as a hedonistic utilitarian, balancing out the happiness of a greater number of people who will benefit from a higher lifestyle, better economic situation from building the dam. More jobs created, they can use electricity in their homes, run modern appliances, maybe have happier lives, balancing that out against the negatives of the mental anguish of the displaced native villagers and the displaced animals for Bentham. So, but another way of tackling the issue of whether or not to build the Bakun Dam is in solely economic terms, and saying, well, the morally right thing to do is what produces the most benefits for least cost. And so are we going to get more economic development and benefits from building the dam? And specifically, is it going to justify our costs? So this avoids Bentham's problem of standardizing on a countable unit, because we can specify what a dollar is. We can't specify with any exactness what a hedon is. But it's utilitarian because it weighs the good, the benefits, against the bad costs in economic terms. And it recommends action on the side of the most benefits or the least costs to society. And I mentioned that in a single-payer healthcare system, care is often rationed. This is what happens in Australia and Great Britain and other countries that haven't. Care is often rationed on an economic basis. The British system uses QALY, quality adjusted life years. If we're going to spend £50,000 giving you this life-saving operation, are we as a society going to get enough bang for the buck on the other end? Are you going to have, as a result, enough quality years of life left to justify the cost? If the answer is no, then you may be denied that care. Because in a single-payer system where the government is the single payer, the cost of your operation is the cost to society. So anyway, moving on. So what are the advantages of utilitarianism? Well, again, boy, this computer is slow. It removes morality from realms that aren't accessible to the senses, right? Morality is not following the commands of a transcendent God or obeying abstract Platonic principles. Now, both Bentham and Mill tried to defend utilitarianism against the charge that it's anti-religious or specifically anti-Christian. Remember, in England, where they're writing, there is a state religion and a state church, the Church of England, what is the Episcopal Church. And so they're writing in a Christian society, and they need to defend their philosophy against the charge that it's anti-Christian. And basically, their contention is it's not necessarily anti-Christian or anti-religious, but it gives you a way of working out what it is morally right to do that does not need to bring in to play theological assumptions. And this is one reason why it's one of the main theories in secular ethics today. And this is one main reason why I go over it, give you some exposure to it, as some of you may have to take a computer ethics course, a business ethics course, a medical ethics course, a nursing ethics course, and you will run across this theory, I guarantee you, and your learning curve won't be quite as steep. Morality is also not a matter for Bentham of obeying abstract, Platonic principles, but it's a matter of promoting pleasure or happiness and lessening pain and unhappiness for real people in the real world we live in. And as I said, this is one way they were trying to respond to Hume's skepticism. They said if we can get morality down to earth, make it just a matter of balancing out pains and pleasures. We have a system of morality within which we can once more talk rationally and reason about right and wrong, and deal with Hume's skeptical claims that morality is just subjective feelings. It's just my feeling about what's morally right versus your feeling. Now, that may be your view of morality. That is the view that a lot of people have in our society today, without knowing that they essentially have a view that Hume espoused 200 years ago. So also, unlike egoism, in other words, you can't get yourself out of the picture as an egoist, because the whole philosophical theory says the right thing to do is to promote the best results for you. But utilitarianism allows us to step back from the situation. The word here is disinterested, not uninterested. To be disinterested is to basically reason things out in this particular situation as if it doesn't affect you. Now, the results for you count in utilitarian reasoning, but Bentham's famous quote on this is, each is to count as one, but none for more than one. In other words, your pains and pleasures matter in your utilitarian calculations, but no more than the pains and pleasures of anyone else affected by your actions. So it can accommodate what philosophers have called the moral point of view, the point of view where we can stand back from the situation and make a moral decision, talk about just doing what is the right thing, even if doing the right thing is not necessarily the choice where we come out the best. And in that little illustration about taking your nephew to the circus, you'll notice that the uncle does not come out the best in what turns out to be the morally best choice for a utilitarian. He gets more pleasure if he chooses staying home reading the book, but there's more overall pleasure versus pain generated by the choice of taking his nephew to the circus, but that does not produce the most pleasure or happiness for the uncle. So key difference. Straightforward and objective says the right course of action is simply what gets the best results. And morality, as Peter Singer says, should make a difference in the world we actually live in. And we made this point before. Ross Harrison makes it at the end of that. This is one of the controversial aspects about utilitarianism, that it can give us a reason to override people's individual rights. If we are a panel deciding on whether to give you that life-saving operation, we may deny it using a utilitarian cost-benefit analysis, but you can say, well, what about your right to life? If we're using eminent domain to take your private property for public use, like we doubtless did across the street, or like the people behind me did with those homes, which is now the off-ramp of the Falls Road exit of the expressway, we're basically not respecting your private property rights, and they're certainly not doing it, or didn't do it, for the private property rights of the villagers there. So, objections to utilitarianism requires too much of us. I showed you that in that diagram about consequentialism, that as a consequentialist theory, it has us look only at the future and future results to make a moral decision. But that requires us, before the fact, to try to predict what's going to happen. And if you're talking about public works projects, this doesn't always happen in a happy manner, right? I was talking about the Big Dig in Boston, this huge infrastructure project that turned out to be billions over budget. I mean, you know, they did not predict how hard it would be working with a particular soil structure under Boston and its proximity to the ocean, how hard it would be to keep the ocean from collapsing subway tunnels or eroding concrete and stuff. And it turned out to be, in other words, they did not do a good job of predicting the costs of the project. So knowing in advance what all the consequences will be is problematic. Deciding on the moral relevance of specific consequences is problematic. You know and I know that we could have made our little example there. Now, I pretty much put it in the slide as it was in the Encyclopedia of Philosophy, but we could have said, well, you know, if you take the kid to the circus, the kid's parents are going to be able to have a night out for themselves, and that's going to make them happier than if they have to stay home. Or it's going to make them happier than if they have to spend money on a babysitter because you, the uncle, weren't able to take the kid to the circus. You know, should we, you know, take into account to our calculations, say, the kid's parents' you know, happiness or unhappiness, you know, and in other words, how far should our calculations go? So predicting others' pains and pleasures is also problematic. I think I talked about that before. So again, because private mental states are unobservable, all we can do is offer educated guesses. I'm not going to say a lot about this, but utilitarianism also has us look at very different consequences. In other words, suppose I'm working a job I don't particularly like. This job I like, but I've had to work other jobs, including this past summer, that I didn't particularly like. But suppose you're working a job you don't really like, but you would like, if you're a guy, you want to get a new 60-inch flat screen for the next football season. Well, how do you balance off, you know, the unpleasantness of working extra hours at a job you don't like versus against the reward of the flat screen? But again, we do make these decisions. Now, it demands too much of us. Well, I already did the second point that may force us to abandon some of the rights. In other words, utilitarians argue for euthanasia from the standpoint of what is called the argument for mercy, that it would be more merciful to allow you the option legally of being euthanized, killed yourself as a human being, rather than you're having to live in excruciating pain for another 6 months and die naturally. But the downside of that, the slippery slope argument, is what if we legalize euthanasia? Would critically ill people then be subtly prompted? Would there be psychological pressure for them to, quote, do the right thing and opt for being euthanized rather than have the state or the insurance companies absorb the cost of their care for the next 6 months, you know. So, so in this case, you could say, well, that infringes on the right to life of the patient if they're being pressured to opt for euthanasia, for utilitarian reasons. Make some discretionary duties mandatory. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but one of the things Peter Singer has argued is, if we're going to be good utilitarians and see it as our moral duty to promote for essentially the world as a whole the best balance of happiness versus unhappiness, and we need to make our choices accordingly, well, let's talk about that new 60-inch flat screen I'd like to get for next football season with my discretionary income. Peter Singer says, wait a second, okay, you're going to have some happiness getting that TV and having some of your buddies over for beer and wings and watching football, but wouldn't you produce a much higher positive impact if you instead gave that money to third world famine relief? You'd maybe even save some lives. And because it's much more likely that you'd produce much more happiness and or relieve much more pain with that choice than giving to a charity like World Vision or Oxfam for third world famine relief should be viewed by you not as an optional discretionary thing. It's a good thing to do if you want to. But if you're a good utilitarian, it should be viewed by you as mandatory from a moral perspective. And most people think, no, the theory shouldn't be trying to make things like that mandatory for us, So this is another criticism of utilitarianism. Again, it recommends immoral actions. Richard Taylor has argued that if having love affairs is very pleasurable, we ought to be morally permitted to do so. So he gives us a moral justification of adultery from utilitarian perspective. But if we say, hey, my spouse would be really hurt if they found out I was running around on them, well, Richard Taylor says, well, hey, we can deal with that. From a utilitarian perspective, you should be able to lie about the affair to protect their feelings. So you get a justification in one article of both adultery and lying, which some people think, well, if the moral theory of utilitarianism goes there, then there's some problems with this moral theory. We talked about a violation of others' rights, breaking a promise. Well, okay, a stock criticism is, I think I told you about the dying uncle on his bed has a profligate nephew, right? And his dying wish is that you give money that he has in his mattress to his nephew, so you promise you'll do it. But from a utilitarian perspective, if he's not going to be wise with his money, not going to produce much happiness, it would be better for you to say, take that money, break your promise to the dying man, and give it instead, as a Benthamite utilitarian, to something like a children's hospital. But you can say, well, you did make a promise to him that you'd give it to his nephew, and it was, after all, his money, and you should respect his autonomous decision to do, and his wishes to do with it what he wants. you know. So, if you think that that's the case, then that's problematic for utilitarianism. Okay, so again, you need to get everything in. Wednesday of next week is our last day, but I'm going to start review Monday. Your exam, again, is a week from Monday. And what did you have as the... Is the exam starting at 10? I forget. At 10. Okay. So, 10, 14 at 10. Yeah. Okay. So, see you then. See you next time. Pardon?
Will you have the exam on Monday? So I can take it?
I'm going to see. I will have an exam that you can take on Monday. Okay. Now, do you want to take it in class or up in my office?
Whenever you want.
Following.
I have class until noon on Monday, and then I can take
Okay.
time after that.
Okay. So if I forget to print one out for you so you can take it in the hall, you can come up to 627, and I'll let you take one in the office.
I'm gonna review this.
Well, okay, but you know, I don't grade. Let me shut off the